Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about partying. This is a story about how a small white pill designed to help people sleep became the most desired drug in America, turned Hollywood into a pharmacy, made millionaires out of college dropouts, and then vanished so completely that most people under 40 have never seen one. A legal prescription became a cultural phenomenon, became a criminal enterprise, became nothing, gone, erased from existence. So if you're here for the journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now. Perhaps tucked under a blanket, halfway between curiosity and sleep. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. To understand how a sleeping pill became the most erased drug in history, you first have to understand the drug it was supposed to replace, and that drug was killing movie stars. Picture America in the late 1950s. Eisenhower is president. The suburbs are expanding. Television is still a novelty. And in medicine cabinets across the country, there's a class of drugs that doctors hand out like candy, and patients swallow like salvation. Barbiturates, Seconal, Nembutal, Amytal, Phenobarbital, names that sound almost quaint now, like something from a black and white movie, which is fitting because that's exactly where a lot of them ended up, on nightstands in Hollywood mansions, in the bloodstreams of people who just wanted to sleep. Barbiturates weren't just addictive, they were lethal in a way that made doctors nervous every time they wrote a prescription. The problem was simple and terrifying. The dose that helped you sleep and the dose that stopped your heart were uncomfortably close together. We're talking about a therapeutic index so narrow that a bad night and a bottle of wine could turn a sleeping pill into a death sentence. Here's what nobody tells you about the drug that killed Marilyn Monroe. When Marilyn died in August 1962, the autopsy found enough barbiturates in her system to kill multiple people, chloral hydrate and Nembutal. She wasn't unique, she was just famous. By the early 1960s, barbiturate overdoses were killing thousands of Americans every year. Some were suicides, some were accidents, some were that grey area in between where someone took one more pill because the first three weren't working yet, and then they just didn't wake up. The line between sleeping and dying was thin enough to cross by accident, and millions of Americans were walking that line every single night. Judy Garland. Another icon, another barbiturate casualty. She'd been given pills by the studios since she was a teenager, uppers to work, downers to sleep. By the time she died in 1969, her body had been a pharmaceutical battleground for 3 decades. The official cause was accidental overdose of barbiturates. The real cause was a system that treated human beings like machines that could be chemically calibrated. Doctors knew they had a problem. The medical journals were full of concerned articles. The phrase barbiturate epidemic started appearing in professional discussions. Hospitals were seeing overdoses at alarming rates. Emergency rooms were becoming experts at pumping stomachs and watching patients die anyway. The medical establishment needed an alternative, something that worked like barbiturates but didn't kill people quite so efficiently, something they could prescribe without lying awake at night wondering if they'd just signed a death warrant. They needed a safer sleeping pill. And here's where our story takes its first ironic turn. In 1951, halfway around the world from Hollywood, an Indian scientist named Indra Kishore Kakar was working on something completely unrelated: malaria. He was part of a research team trying to develop new anti-malarial compounds. Malaria was killing millions of people across the developing world, and scientists everywhere were searching for new treatments. Kakar synthesized a compound called methaqualone. It didn't work against malaria, not even close. But during testing, researchers noticed something interesting. The compound had powerful sedative properties. Animals given methaqualone became calm, then drowsy, then deeply asleep. A scientist looking for a malaria cure accidentally created Hollywood's favorite party favor. That's how most disasters start, with someone trying to help. The drug that would eventually be erased from existence was created by accident, looking for something else entirely. The best things and the worst things often start the same way, with curiosity, with good intentions, with someone in a lab coat thinking, that's interesting. For about a decade, methaqualone remained a scientific curiosity. Researchers in various countries poked at it, published papers about it, noted its sedative effects. It made its way to Europe first, where it was marketed in the early 1960s under names like Mandrax and Rivoronil. German and British doctors started prescribing it for insomnia, and they noticed something that got the attention of pharmaceutical companies worldwide. Their patients weren't dying. The overdose profile looked much better than barbiturates. The therapeutic index was wider. You could take more of this drug without stopping your heart. Addiction seemed less severe. Withdrawal seemed less dangerous. On paper, methaqualone looked like exactly what the medical world had been praying for. Now here's where money enters the story, because money always enters the story. Pharmaceutical companies saw the European data and started running calculations. Millions of Americans were taking barbiturates every night. Millions more probably would if they weren't scared of the risks. If you could offer those people something safer, something they could take without the nagging fear of not waking up, well, that's not just a medical breakthrough, that's a market. Multiple companies raced to develop their own version. The William H. Rorer Company got there first in America. In 1965, they introduced their methaqualone product under a brand name that would become synonymous with an era, Quaalude. The name was supposedly a combination of quiet and interlude. A quiet interlude, a peaceful pause in the chaos of modern life. The marketing practically wrote itself. Other companies followed fast. Parker Davis brought out Parist. Smith Miller and Patch released Sopor. There was Optimiel, Melcid, Meccan, different names, same molecule, all of them marketed with the same promise. Safe and non-addictive. Write those words down. They're going to appear on a lot of prescriptions over the next 2 decades. They're also going to appear on a lot of gravestones. The pharmaceutical representatives fanned out across America with their sample cases and their clinical studies and their carefully rehearsed talking points. They visited doctors' offices and hospital departments. They bought lunches and left brochures. They explained with charts and graphs and the authority of science that this new drug was different, not like barbiturates, not dangerous, not habit-forming. That phrase, non-addictive, will show up again and again in this story. And every time it does, remember, someone was lying. They just hadn't figured that out yet. Maybe the salespeople believed it. Maybe the company scientists believed it. Maybe everyone in the chain believed it. Because believing it was easier than questioning it. And because there was money to be made in belief. The doctors believed it too. Most of them anyway. You have to understand the position they were in. They had patients who couldn't sleep, real people with real problems. Insomnia isn't trivial. Chronic sleeplessness destroys quality of life, impairs judgment, contributes to accidents, worsens mental health. These patients needed help, and for years the only effective help had come with a side of might accidentally kill you. Now here was something better. Here was something the studies said was safe. Here was something the FDA had approved. Here was something the pharmaceutical companies, with all their resources and research, were swearing up and down was the answer. What were they supposed to do? Keep prescribing the drugs that were killing their patients? Refuse to use a new tool because of vague unease? Doctors started prescribing. Patients started swallowing. Pharmacies started stocking up. By the late 1960s, Quaalude prescriptions were multiplying like rabbits. Insomnia, anxiety, muscle tension, preoperative sedation. If you needed to calm down, slow down, or sleep, there was probably a Quaalude prescription in your future. The pill was usually white, round, imprinted with whatever company made it. Nothing special to look at. Just another pharmaceutical product doing pharmaceutical work. The medical promise seemed to be holding. Patients weren't dying at barbiturate rates. Emergency rooms weren't seeing the same overdose patterns. The feared addiction didn't seem to be materializing, at least not in the ways doctors were trained to recognize. Everything looked promising. Everything seemed reasonable. Of course there were hints. There are always hints, if you know where to look. Some patients seemed awfully eager for refills. Some developed tolerances faster than the literature suggested. Some experienced withdrawal symptoms that didn't quite match the non-addictive label. A few voices in the wilderness started asking uncomfortable questions. Those voices were mostly ignored. Not silenced exactly, just not amplified. The drug was working, the money was flowing, the alternative was going back to barbiturates. Nobody wanted that. So here we are, 1965, a new drug, a clean slate, a promise of safety. The chemistry made sense. Methaqualone worked on GABA receptors in the brain, similar to barbiturates but with subtle differences that seemed to make it gentler. The research looked solid, the regulatory approvals had been granted, the demand was obvious and growing, the profits were substantial and rising. Everything seemed reasonable at the time. That's always how it seems at the time. The decisions that will later look insane always seem perfectly rational when you're making them. The drug that will later need to be erased from existence entirely looks in this moment like simple progress, better living through chemistry, a safer world through pharmaceutical innovation. The medical establishment had found its replacement for barbiturates. The pharmaceutical companies had found their next blockbuster. The patients had found their relief. What nobody had found, not yet, was what this drug would become once it escaped the medicine cabinet and discovered the bedroom. But that's later. For now, the 1960s are ending. The 1970s are about to begin. And somewhere in America, someone is about to figure out that this sleeping pill does something interesting when you decide not to sleep. Something very, very interesting. By 1972, Quaalude had become the most commonly prescribed sedative in America. What nobody could explain was why so many prescriptions were being written for stress. Stress, it turns out, was the most profitable diagnosis in pharmaceutical history. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are where this story gets interesting. In 1972, American pharmacies filled approximately 4 million prescriptions for methaqualone products. By 1973, that number had nearly doubled. We're talking about a drug that went from new market entrant to industry dominator in less than a decade. 4 million prescriptions. Think about that for a second. That's not a niche medication for a rare condition. That's a significant percentage of the adult population taking the same drug for the same vague reason. The reason, according to the prescription pads, was usually some variation of anxiety, tension, or that wonderfully elastic term, stress. Stress. The diagnosis that means everything and nothing. The symptom that can't be measured, can't be disproven, and can't be questioned without making the patient feel dismissed. A patient walks in, says they're stressed, and walks out with a prescription. What's a conscientious doctor supposed to do? Argue. There's a medical term for what was happening. It's called overprescribing. There's a street term too. It's called dealing. The mechanics were simple. Pharmaceutical representatives visited doctors' offices with samples, studies, and incentives. Doctors prescribed the samples, saw that patients liked them, and kept prescribing. Patients told their friends, friends told their doctors. They had the same stress their friends had. Doctors wrote more prescriptions. The cycle fed itself. More patients meant more demand. More demand meant more sales calls. More sales calls meant more prescriptions. The machine was beautifully efficient at doing exactly what it was designed to do, move product, and product was moving. Pharmacies in certain neighborhoods couldn't keep Quaaludes in stock. Refill requests came in faster than anyone anticipated. Patients who should have had a month's supply were calling after 2 weeks, explaining that they'd lost the bottle, or their dog ate some, or they'd been under extra stress lately, and could they please get an early refill. The doctors who paid attention noticed patterns. Certain patients always needed more. Certain patients doctor shopped, collecting prescriptions from multiple physicians. Certain patients displayed what we would now recognize as obvious signs of dependency, showing up anxious and irritable when their supply ran low, almost desperate in their requests for more. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The warning signs were there, they were documented, they were published in medical journals, and they were completely systematically ignored. As early as 1971, case reports began appearing in medical literature describing methaqualone dependence. Real patients, real addiction, real withdrawal symptoms. Doctors writing to warn their colleagues, this drug we've been calling non-addictive, it's addicting people. The reports were acknowledged and filed away. The prescriptions continued. The medical profession's answer to "is this addictive?" was "we prefer to think of it as habit-forming." Semantic comfort for an uncomfortable truth. There's a particular kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when a system is making money. Questions that might disrupt the revenue stream get answered in ways that allow business to continue. Concerns get minimized. Evidence gets reinterpreted. The uncomfortable truth gets reframed until it becomes comfortable enough to ignore. The doctors who noticed something wrong and spoke up, they were treated like the crazy ones. Alarmists, people who didn't understand the full picture, people who were letting perfect be the enemy of good. The doctors who kept prescribing, they were rich. Not all of them. Most doctors were just doing their jobs, treating patients who said they needed help. But some doctors figured out that there was gold in those prescription pads, that a patient seeking Quaaludes was a patient who would come back again and again, money in hand each time. Some doctors stopped pretending to practice medicine and just started practicing commerce. But that's a story for later. Right now, we need to talk about what was happening outside the examination rooms. Because while the medical establishment was debating whether methoqualone was addictive or merely habit-forming, the patients had already figured out the answer. They'd figured out something else too. This drug, this sleeping pill, this treatment for stress and anxiety and insomnia, it did something unexpected when you decided not to sleep. This is where the story splits into two tracks. The official track, medicine helping people sleep. The real track, something else entirely. Here's what a Quaalude high actually felt like according to the people who experienced it. First, there was relaxation, deep, profound relaxation. The tension you didn't even know you were carrying started to dissolve. Your muscles went soft, your jaw unclenched. The constant background noise of anxiety dimmed to a whisper. Then came the warmth, a spreading warmth that seemed to radiate from your center outward. Everything felt softer. The edges of the world got fuzzy in a pleasant way. Colors seemed richer. Music sounded better. The person you were talking to suddenly seemed more interesting than they'd ever been before. And then came the thing that gave Quaaludes their reputation. Physical sensation intensified. Touch became electric. Inhibitions, those careful walls we build around our desires, began to crumble. The awkwardness that normally accompanies intimacy just evaporated. Everything felt right. Everything felt easy. Everything felt possible. Users started calling it the love drug. They weren't talking about love in the romantic sense. They were talking about something more immediate, more physical. The drug seemed to make connection effortless and sensation extraordinary. In a culture that was still learning to talk openly about sex, Quaaludes became a shortcut to places that usually required trust and vulnerability. The mythology built on itself. Word spread through social networks that existed long before the term had anything to do with computers. Friends told friends. Partners told partners. The reputation grew from whisper to common knowledge to accepted fact. Quaaludes weren't just for sleeping anymore. They were for Saturday night. And here's where the demographic started shifting. The original Quaalude patient was typically middle-aged, often female, dealing with the insomnia that came from managing a household, or the anxiety that came from suppressing everything that needed suppressing in mid-century American life. These were people with medicine cabinets and family doctors and legitimate prescriptions. But increasingly, the person taking Quaaludes was young, college-aged, not stressed in any clinical sense, just interested in what all the talk was about. Not visiting doctors, just visiting friends who had access. Not treating insomnia, just treating boredom. The drug migrated from medicine cabinets to sock drawers to party supplies. The line between taking as prescribed and taking for fun was getting blurry. Soon it would disappear entirely. Pills that left pharmacies as medical treatment arrived at parties as recreational enhancement. The same molecule served two entirely different purposes depending on who was swallowing it and why. A 50-year-old woman took it to sleep. Her 22-year-old son took it to do the opposite. And the prescription system couldn't tell the difference. Didn't want to tell the difference. Every pill sold was a pill sold, regardless of what happened after the pharmacy bag left the counter. By the early 1970s, Quaaludes had achieved something remarkable. They had become simultaneously a mainstream medication and an underground phenomenon. They were respectable enough for doctors to prescribe without embarrassment and exciting enough for young people to seek without prescriptions. They existed in two worlds at once, and in both worlds demand was exploding. The pharmaceutical companies saw sales figures and saw success. The medical establishments saw prescription numbers and saw treatment. The patients saw pills and saw what they wanted to see: sleep, or stress relief, or a better Saturday night. Nobody with power was looking at the whole picture, or maybe some of them were, and they liked what they saw. A drug designed to help people sleep was keeping a lot of people very, very awake, and those people were about to get very, very famous. Because while Quaaludes were conquering suburban medicine cabinets and college dormitories, they were also making their way to a very particular zip code, a place where the appetite for pharmaceutical enhancement had existed for decades, a place where the demand for anything that made the nights feel infinite had always been strong, a place called Hollywood. Hollywood didn't discover Quaaludes. Quaaludes discovered Hollywood, and Hollywood had exactly the lifestyle the drug was built for: high-pressure days that needed to end, and long nights that needed to feel infinite. To understand why Quaaludes and the entertainment industry became inseparable, you need to understand something about Hollywood's relationship with pills. It didn't start in the 1970s, it started decades earlier, and it was built into the system from the beginning. The studios had been giving performers pills since the 1930s. This isn't conspiracy. This isn't rumor. This is documented history. Studio doctors kept performers chemically optimized like they were precision instruments. Uppers to get through 18-hour shooting days. Downers to sleep when your body was still vibrating from the uppers. Diet pills to stay thin. Sedatives to stay calm. Stimulants to stay sharp. Judy Garland was 15 years old when MGM started her on amphetamines. 15. A child given speed by adults who needed her to perform on schedule and on budget. She'd spend the rest of her too short life chasing a chemical equilibrium that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what was happening. She wasn't unique, she was just the one we remember. The Judy Garland generation gave way to the Elvis generation, gave way to the Quaalude generation. Different decades, different pills, same fundamental transaction. The industry takes your time and your youth, and in exchange it gives you chemicals to help you survive the taking. By the early 1970s, the old studio system had collapsed, but the pharmaceutical culture remained. Performers still worked in human hours. They still needed to be on when the cameras rolled and off when they finally stopped. They still reached for pills to manage the transition. Quaaludes were just the newest downer, but they came with a bonus feature nobody had anticipated. Unlike barbiturates, which basically knocked you unconscious, Quaaludes offered something different. Something more recreational. You could take a Quaalude and stay awake, stay social, stay engaged with the world around you. Just softer, warmer, more open. For people whose professional lives required them to be constantly performing, constantly charming, constantly on, this was revolutionary. Here was a drug that let you turn off the performance anxiety without turning off entirely. You could relax without disappearing. You could unwind without missing the party. And in Hollywood, there was always a party. The celebrity adoption happened fast. By the mid-1970s, Quaaludes were as common at industry gatherings as cocaine would become a few years later. They were at rap parties and premiere after-parties. They were at the private clubs and the private homes of people whose names you'd recognize instantly. Music absorbed them too. David Bowie referenced them. So did Frank Zappa. Jerry Garcia was reportedly a fan. The drug showed up in lyrics and liner notes and the background stories of albums recorded in hazy late-night sessions. But the real cathedral of Quaalude culture wasn't a recording studio or a film set. It was a nightclub in Manhattan. Studio 54 opened in April 1977, and for the next 3 years it would be the most famous nightclub on earth. The velvet ropes, the celebrity guest lists, the debauchery that made the newspapers and the debauchery that didn't. Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager had created something unprecedented, a space where fame and anonymity coexisted, where anything could happen because nobody was supposed to remember it clearly anyway. Quaaludes were the house drug. Not officially, of course. Nothing at Studio 54 was official, but everyone knew. The pills circulated through the crowd like party favors. People called them disco biscuits, which made them sound almost innocent. Little treats to enhance the evening. Something to take the edge off before you hit the dance floor. Studio 54 wasn't just a nightclub. It was a pharmaceutical distribution center with a better DJ. The atmosphere was designed for chemical enhancement. The lights, the music, the press of bodies on the dance floor. Everything was calibrated to feel overwhelming in exactly the right way when your nervous system was softened by methaqualone. The experience of being there, really being there on the right substances, became legendary. People who lived through Studio 54 will tell you it was magical. People who study Studio 54 will tell you the magic had a cost that wasn't evenly distributed. I need to pause here and address something directly. Some of what happened at these parties wasn't partying. It was predation, and Quaaludes made that predation easier. The love drug had a dark secret. Love requires consent, and Quaaludes were very good at erasing the line between willing and unable. The pharmacological effects that made the drug attractive for recreation, the lowered inhibitions, the enhanced physical sensation, the dissolution of normal boundaries, those same effects made people vulnerable. A person on Quaaludes might agree to things they wouldn't otherwise agree to, might not be able to resist things they wanted to resist, might not remember clearly what had happened until later, if ever. Here's the uncomfortable truth about the love drug. Who called it that and who experienced it that way were often very different groups of people. The legal record is clear on at least some of this. In 1977, Roman Polanski pleaded guilty to unlawful sex with a minor. The victim, a 13-year-old girl, testified that Polanski had given her champagne and part of a Quaalude before the assault. 13 years old, champagne and Quaaludes. This wasn't a grey area. This was a crime facilitated by a drug that made crimes easier to commit. Decades later, Bill Cosby's history would come to light. Dozens of women accused him of sexual assault, many describing being drugged with Quaaludes before the assaults occurred. Cosby himself, in a 2005 deposition, admitted to obtaining Quaaludes to give to women he wanted to have sex with. His words, under oath. The beloved television father had been using the love drug as a weapon. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the documented cases, the ones that made it to courtrooms and depositions. How many undocumented cases happened at Hollywood parties, at industry gatherings, at private homes where the drug flowed freely and the power dynamics were stacked against young women trying to build careers? We'll never know the full number. We only know it wasn't small. The gender dimension of Quaalude culture is impossible to ignore once you see it. The drug was often given by men to women. The party mythology, the love drug reputation, was largely constructed by and for men who benefited from lowered inhibitions that weren't their own. This doesn't mean everyone who took Quaaludes recreationally was a predator or a victim. Millions of people used the drug consensually, with partners they trusted, for experiences they genuinely wanted to have. The drug itself wasn't evil, but it existed within a culture of power imbalances, and it tilted those imbalances further. Now, here's where the story gets complicated in a different way. Because despite all of this, despite the documented assaults and the obvious risks, Quaalude culture didn't stay underground. It went mainstream. By the mid-1970s, the drug was showing up everywhere in popular culture. Songs referenced it, movies featured it, television comedians built bits around it. Johnny Carson made Quaalude jokes on The Tonight Show. Saturday Night Live did sketches. The pill that was being used to facilitate assaults was also being used to generate laughs. By 1977, you couldn't watch late-night television without hearing a Quaalude joke. A drug that was supposed to be controlled, monitored, prescribed carefully, had become a punchline. And here's the thing about punchlines. They don't get regulated. They get laughed at. The normalization was complete. Quaaludes weren't just tolerated in Hollywood. They were celebrated. Knowing about them was proof you were in the know. Taking them was proof you could hang. Offering them was hospitality. The cultural messaging was confused at best, complicit at worst. The same entertainment industry that was supposed to reflect American values was actively promoting a controlled substance as a lifestyle accessory. The same publications that ran stories about drug abuse also ran profiles of celebrities who were obviously using. The same moral guardians who worried about marijuana were silent about the white pills circulating at every industry event. When celebrities do something, it stops being deviant and starts being aspirational. That's how celebrity works. That's its power and its danger. So Quaaludes became aspirational. Not just in Hollywood, but everywhere Hollywood's influence reached, which was everywhere. Kids in the Midwest saw movies featuring casual drug use. Teenagers in the suburbs heard songs referencing ludes. College students read interviews with rock stars talking about their favorite ways to unwind. The culture was teaching an entire generation that Quaaludes were cool, normal, something successful people did. The pharmaceutical companies watched this happen and said nothing. What were they supposed to say? Every cultural reference was free advertising. Every celebrity who swallowed their product in public was an unpaid endorsement. The street demand fueled the prescription demand, and the prescription demand fueled the profits. The medical establishment watched this happen and said nothing effective. By now, the evidence of addiction and dependence was overwhelming, but the prescriptions kept flowing because the patients kept asking, and the doctors kept writing, and nobody with power had any incentive to stop. Law enforcement watched this happen, and mostly focused elsewhere. There were bigger problems than a party drug popular with rich people. There were inner-city drug markets to police, marijuana to eradicate, heroin to intercept. Quaaludes were a problem for a different department, a different budget, a different priority list that never quite got reorganized. And so the honeymoon continued. Hollywood made Quaaludes glamorous. Glamour made them desirable. Desire made them profitable. Profit kept everyone quiet who might otherwise have asked uncomfortable questions. But there's a detail we haven't addressed yet, a practical matter that tends to get overlooked when we're talking about cultural phenomena and celebrity behavior and the complicated ethics of pharmaceutical recreation. Someone had to supply all those pills. Hollywood was consuming Quaaludes at a rate that legitimate prescriptions couldn't explain. The math didn't work. Even with overprescribing, even with stress clinics and compliant doctors and a medical system that wasn't asking hard questions, there weren't enough prescription pads in California to account for what was being consumed at the parties, which means someone else was providing, which means there was a supply chain operating parallel to the pharmaceutical one, an informal economy, a grey market that was about to turn very, very dark. Hollywood made Quaaludes glamorous, but someone had to supply Hollywood, and that supply chain was about to get very, very interesting. Here's something that will bother you for the rest of this video. Almost everything I'm about to describe was legal, not tolerated, not overlooked. Legal. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as designed. The design was just insane. By the mid-1970s, a new kind of medical practice had emerged in cities across America. They were called stress clinics, which sounds almost therapeutic, calming, a place you might go to learn meditation or practice breathing exercises. That's not what they were. A stress clinic worked like this. You walked in off the street. You waited in a room with 20 other people who had walked in off the street. A doctor, or someone wearing a white coat anyway, called you back. They asked how you were feeling. You said stressed. They wrote a prescription. You paid cash. You left. Next patient. The average stress clinic appointment lasted 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, a doctor could write a prescription worth $500 on the street for a drug that cost $5 at the pharmacy. That's not medicine. That's arbitrage. Let me give you the economics, because once you see the economics, you understand everything. A Quaalude cost a pharmaceutical company roughly 5 cents to manufacture. 5 cents. The cost of raw materials, production, packaging, quality control, 5 cents per pill. The company sold that pill to a distributor for maybe 20 cents. The distributor sold it to a pharmacy for maybe 35 cents. The pharmacy, with a prescription in hand, sold it to a patient for somewhere between 50 cents and $1, depending on their markup. That patient could then walk outside and sell that same pill to someone without a prescription for $3 to $5. Stop and think about those numbers. A 6,000% markup from production to street sale. Legal production, legal distribution, legal prescription, illegal sale. The only illegal step was the last one, and that step was being done by someone else entirely. The doctor's hands were clean. The pharmacist's hands were clean. The pharmaceutical company's hands were clean. Only the person at the very end of the chain, the one making the smallest profit, was breaking any law. The stress clinic doctors understood this arithmetic intimately. A doctor seeing 40 patients a day at a stress clinic, spending 7 minutes per patient, writing prescriptions averaging 100 pills each, could generate staggering income. We're talking about doctors making $300,000, $400,000 a year in 1975 money. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $1 million today. For writing prescriptions, for 7 minutes at a time, for stress. If you wanted to sell drugs legally, medical school was the most expensive dealer fee in history. But the ROI was incredible. The clinics clustered in certain areas. South Florida became a hotspot. Southern California, parts of New York and New Jersey. Anywhere with a population hungry for pharmaceuticals and a regulatory environment that wasn't paying close attention. The difference between a stress clinic and a drug dealer was a white coat and a receptionist. That's not hyperbole, that's a functional description. Both entities existed to transfer controlled substances from the pharmaceutical supply chain to people who wanted them recreationally. Both made money from the transaction. Both served demand that had nothing to do with legitimate medical need. The only difference was which side of a legal line they stood on, and that legal line was surveyed by regulators who weren't particularly interested in surveying. Now, here's where the psychology gets interesting. Some of these doctors were straightforward criminals. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the patients weren't really stressed, or at least not in any medically meaningful sense. They knew the prescriptions would end up on the street. They didn't care. Money was money, and nobody was stopping them. But some of these doctors had convinced themselves they were helping people. Stress, after all, is real. Modern life is genuinely anxiety-inducing. The patients in their waiting rooms were genuinely unhappy about something. Why shouldn't medicine provide relief? Why should suffering people be denied treatment just because their suffering wasn't visible on an X-ray? These doctors had developed elaborate internal justifications. They weren't drug dealers. They were compassionate physicians serving an underserved population. They were meeting a genuine need that the establishment medical system was too uptight to acknowledge. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable, especially when the deception is profitable. Most stress clinic doctors were probably somewhere in the middle, aware that something wasn't quite right, aware that the patient load was suspiciously uniform, aware that real insomnia patients don't usually pay cash and disappear before you can establish a medical file, but not so aware that they stopped, not so aware that they asked questions they didn't want answered, not so aware that they walked away from the money. Some of these doctors genuinely believed stress was an epidemic and they were treating it. Some of them knew exactly what they were doing. Most were somewhere in the middle where self-deception meets self-interest. That middle ground is where most human corruption lives, not in villainy, but in convenient blindness. The question isn't how did bad doctors get away with this? The question is why did the system make it so easy for good doctors to become bad ones? And the answer is because nobody was watching. And nobody was watching because nobody was paid to watch. This is the part where you might expect the government to step in. You'd be waiting a long time. The DEA existed, of course. The Drug Enforcement Administration had been created in 1973, consolidating various federal drug enforcement agencies under one roof. They had authority. They had agents. They had, in theory, the ability to investigate and prosecute doctors who were functioning as dealers. In practice, they were overwhelmed. The DEA in the 1970s was focused on the dramatic stuff: international smuggling operations, heroin trafficking, cocaine shipments, the headlines, the visible crimes that photographed well and played well in congressional hearings. Investigating doctors was different. Doctors had lawyers. Doctors had medical licenses issued by state boards. Doctors had professional associations that would push back against federal interference. Doctors had political connections and community standing and the presumption of respectability that came with the title. Proving that a doctor was prescribing in bad faith was legally difficult. The doctor could always claim they believed their patients. The doctor could always point to their medical training, their clinical judgment, their professional discretion. Who was a DEA agent to second-guess a licensed physician's medical decisions? The DEA was playing whack-a-mole with doctors who had law degrees, medical degrees, and an excellent understanding of exactly how much they could prescribe before anyone noticed. State medical boards weren't much help either. These boards existed to police the profession, to investigate complaints, to discipline doctors who violated standards of care. But the boards were staffed by doctors themselves, and doctors were reluctant to destroy the careers of other doctors. Professional solidarity ran deep. The instinct was to protect, to counsel, to give second chances. A doctor caught prescribing excessively might receive a warning, a stern letter, a requirement for additional training. The nuclear option, license revocation, was reserved for the most egregious cases, and even then, appeals could drag on for years. The boards moved slowly, the stress clinics moved fast. By the time regulators caught up with one operation, 3 more had opened nearby. Remember this regulatory failure. Write it down, put a pin in it, because in about 40 years the exact same failure will enable the opioid crisis, the same inability to police prescription practices, the same reluctance to investigate doctors, the same deference to professional judgment over evidence of obvious abuse. The system didn't learn. Systems rarely do. They just repeat. The pharmaceutical companies watched all of this happen and said nothing useful. Officially, they were concerned about diversion. Officially, they cooperated with law enforcement. Officially, they wanted their products used appropriately and safely. Unofficially, every diverted pill was a sold pill. Every stress clinic prescription added to their sales figures. Every illegal use increased demand, which increased prescriptions, which increased revenue. The companies weren't stupid. They knew what was happening. They saw the regional sales data that showed certain areas consuming vastly more methaqualone than could be medically justified. They saw which distributors were ordering suspicious quantities. They saw the pattern. They chose not to look too closely at what they saw. This is how legal systems become drug distribution networks. Not through conspiracy, but through aligned incentives. Everyone in the chain benefits from volume. No one in the chain is responsible for outcomes. The manufacturer isn't responsible for how the distributor sells. The distributor isn't responsible for how the pharmacy dispenses. The pharmacy isn't responsible for how the patient uses. The doctor isn't responsible for what happens after the prescription is filled. Responsibility fragments until it disappears entirely. What's left is just product flowing through a pipeline, making money for everyone it touches, answerable to no one. The stress clinics were the weak point in this system, the visible absurdity, the place where the pretense of legitimate medicine was thinnest, but they were also just a symptom. The disease was deeper. The disease was a regulatory architecture that assumed good faith from every participant, while providing massive incentives for bad faith. By the late 1970s, the stress clinic economy was pumping millions of pills into the recreational market every year. Millions. Not thousands. Millions. The legitimate pharmaceutical production feeding the illegitimate pharmaceutical demand, with prescription pads serving as the laundry mechanism that cleaned the transaction. Some clinics eventually got raided. Some doctors eventually lost their licenses. The DEA eventually made examples of the most obvious offenders, but the fundamental dynamics remained unchanged. For every clinic that closed, another opened. For every doctor prosecuted, another saw an opportunity. The arbitrage was too attractive, the oversight was too thin, the money was too good. But here's the thing about supply chains. They have choke points, places where everything has to flow through a narrow passage. The stress clinics were one part of the distribution network. The pharmaceutical manufacturers were another. And in the Quaalude market, one manufacturer dominated. One company was supplying most of those pills. One factory was producing the vast majority of methaqualone consumed in America, legally and illegally. One brand name had become so famous, so ubiquitous, so trusted by users that it had transcended pharmaceutical marketing and become something else entirely. A cultural icon, a status symbol, a guarantee of quality in a market where quality was everything. That company's name was about to become more famous than any pharmaceutical brand in history. The name was Lemon, and the number was 714. If I showed you a picture of a small white pill with the word lemon stamped above the number 714, some of you would recognize it instantly. If you're under 35, you probably wouldn't. That three-digit number became the most famous pharmaceutical imprint in American history, more recognizable than any medicine cabinet staple, more iconic than aspirin or Tylenol or any of the brands pharmaceutical companies spend billions trying to establish. And the company that made it was run out of a small town in Pennsylvania by people who never expected to become drug kingpins, at least not the legal kind. Lemon Pharmaceutical Company was founded in 1897 in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. Sellersville, a town of about 5,000 people, about 40 miles north of Philadelphia, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where families work at the same company for generations, where the company picnic is a big deal and the factory whistle marks the rhythm of daily life. This was not, to put it mildly, the expected birthplace of a drug culture icon. Lemon spent most of its existence as a modest generic drug manufacturer. They made the pills that filled prescriptions when patients couldn't afford the name brands. Aspirin, antihistamines, basic pharmaceuticals, nothing glamorous, nothing controversial, just a company making medicine in small-town America. When methaqualone came along, Lemon was one of several companies that obtained licenses to produce it. Nothing special about that. It was a new drug with a growing market. Of course they wanted in. What made Lemon different was quality. Lemon made the best Quaaludes in America. That's an uncomfortable sentence for a pharmaceutical company. Best wasn't supposed to mean most effective for getting high. Best was supposed to mean most consistent dosing, most reliable manufacturing, most trustworthy for medical purposes. But in the methaqualone market, all of those things added up to something else entirely. Lemon's quality control was excellent. Every pill contained exactly what it was supposed to contain. The dosage was precise. The formulation was consistent. Batch after batch, year after year, a lemon Quaalude delivered exactly the same experience. For legitimate medical purposes, this was simply good manufacturing practice. For recreational purposes, this was everything. When you're taking a drug to get high, consistency matters enormously. You want to know what you're getting. You want to be able to predict the effect. You want to trust that the pill you're taking tonight will do what the pill you took last week did. Other manufacturers had quality variations. Their pills might be slightly stronger or weaker batch to batch. Nothing dangerous, nothing that violated FDA standards, but enough variation that experienced users noticed. Lemon pills were always the same, and in a market where reliability was worth paying premium prices for, that consistency became legendary. The pill itself was distinctive. White, round, about the size of an aspirin. On one side, the word Elimern in capital letters. Below it, the number 714. That was the product code, a standard pharmaceutical identification number that meant nothing in particular, until it meant everything. Think about how strange this is. A pharmaceutical imprint, literally just a company name and a product code stamped into a pill, became a cultural symbol. That's like making a meme out of a serial number. That's like turning a UPC code into a status symbol. But that's exactly what happened. 714 inches stopped being a product code and became a password, a signal, a proof of authenticity in a market increasingly flooded with pretenders. If someone offered you Quaaludes at a party, the first question was always the same: are they real 714s? The number showed up in songs. Comedians referenced it. It appeared in movie dialogue and television scripts. 714 inches became shorthand for the genuine article, the real thing, the standard against which all other pills were measured. If you had real 714s in 1979, you were somebody. The pill itself was proof of authenticity. You could show it to someone, let them see that Lemon's stamp, that's 714, and they knew what they were getting. It was quality assurance in a transaction that had no other quality assurance available. Pharmaceutical branding is supposed to build trust with doctors. Lemon accidentally built a street brand that rivaled Nike. The irony is almost too perfect. A family company in rural Pennsylvania, founded in the 19th century producing generic medications for modest profits, had somehow created the most recognized drug brand in America, not through marketing, not through advertising, through the simple accident of making a reliable product in a market that desperately valued reliability. Lemon 714 wasn't just a pill, it was a promise. 3 digits that guaranteed you weren't getting ripped off, at least until the counterfeiters figured that out. But before we get to the counterfeits, we need to talk about the position lemon found itself in, because it's a position that pharmaceutical companies keep finding themselves in, decade after decade, and they keep answering the dilemma the same way. By the late 1970s, lemon knew their product was being abused. How could they not know? It was in the newspapers. It was in the magazines. It was on television. Their brand name was being used as a punchline on late-night comedy shows. Studio 54's drug of choice carried their imprint. Rock stars wrote songs about their pills. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't ambiguous. This was about as obvious gets. And yet production continued. Sales continued. Profits continued. Lemon was doing everything legally required of them. They manufactured to FDA standards. They sold through licensed distributors. They maintained proper records. They didn't market directly to recreational users. They didn't encourage abuse. They simply made a product and sold it to people legally authorized to buy it. What happened after that wasn't their responsibility, at least legally. They were also making millions from a drug being abused by millions. Both things were true simultaneously. That's the corner the law had painted them into. What do you do when your legal product is being used illegally, but you're not the one using it illegally? This is the question every pharmaceutical company eventually faces. Opioid manufacturers would face it decades later. The answers are remarkably consistent across time and across companies. You keep selling. You tell yourself you're not responsible for how people misuse your product. You tell yourself the legitimate medical need is real, and serving that need is what you do. You tell yourself that stopping production would only push users toward more dangerous alternatives. You tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself to keep the manufacturing lines running and the profits flowing. Maybe some of it is even true. Maybe some users would turn to more dangerous drugs if methaqualone disappeared. Maybe legitimate insomnia patients would suffer. Maybe the responsible thing really was to keep producing. But also, the money was good, and the law wasn't stopping them, and no one was making them confront the gap between what was legal and what was right. The company that made America's favorite party drug was a family business in rural Pennsylvania. That's the kind of irony that writes itself. Were the executives at Lemon villains? Probably not in any meaningful sense. They were business people running a business, making decisions that business people make, following laws designed by regulators who presumably knew what they were doing. The villainy, if we want to call it that, was distributed so thoroughly through the system that nobody had to hold very much of it. The regulators who approved the drug, the doctors who overprescribed it, the pharmacies that filled suspicious prescriptions, the distributors who didn't ask questions, the company that manufactured without examining where their product ended up. Everyone played their part. Nobody was responsible for the whole. But somewhere in Sellersville, Pennsylvania, factory workers were producing pills that would end up in Studio 54 bathrooms and Hollywood mansions, and college dorm rooms across America. They probably didn't think about that much. They probably just thought about the paycheck and the health insurance, and the fact that the company had been good to their families for generations. The strangeness of modern economics is that you can participate in something enormous without ever seeing its shape. Now, the counterfeits. Once Lemon had established 714 as the gold standard, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to copy it. The economics were irresistible. A real Lemon 714 sold for $3 to $5 on the street. The pill cost Lemon maybe 5 cents to make. If you could manufacture something that looked like a 714, you could sell it for the same price as a 714, and your profit margin would be even better than Lemon's. You just had to make something that looked right and felt roughly right and wouldn't immediately reveal itself as fake. Counterfeiters started small. Basement operations with pill presses purchased from restaurant supply companies. The same equipment used to make vitamins or mints could make something that looked like a Quaalude. The word lemon stamped above the number 714. The right size, the right shape, the right color. If you didn't look too closely, if you didn't know exactly what a real 714 felt like in your hand, you might not notice the difference. At first, the counterfeits were mostly methaqualone, real drug, fake branding. The experience was similar enough that users didn't complain. They were knockoffs, but they were functional knockoffs. Then the counterfeits got worse. Once counterfeits entered the market, the math changed. A real 714 was dangerous in the way that any sedative is dangerous. You could overdose, you could mix it with alcohol and stop breathing. The risks were known and quantifiable. A fake 714 could be anything. Some counterfeits contained methaqualone cut with fillers. Same drug, lower dose, less consistent effect. Disappointing but not deadly. Some counterfeits contained other sedatives entirely. Barbiturates, maybe. Benzodiazepines. Different drugs with different risk profiles, sold as something they weren't. Some counterfeits contained things that had no business being in anyone's body. Contaminants from dirty manufacturing. Chemicals that were never meant to be consumed. When you bought a pill on the street, you had no way of knowing what was in it. The Lemon 714 stamp was a promise, but it was a promise anyone with a pill press could make. The guarantee of quality had become a mask that danger wore. The flood of counterfeits accelerated through the early 1980s. As legitimate prescriptions became harder to obtain, as the stress clinics faced more scrutiny, as the DEA slowly increased pressure on the pharmaceutical supply chain, the counterfeit market expanded to fill the gap. Users who thought they knew what they were taking discovered they didn't. Overdoses increased. Emergency rooms saw patients who had taken something they thought was a Quaalude but reacted like they'd taken something else entirely. The brand that Lemon had built so carefully, the reputation for reliability that had made their pills the most desired in America, was being exploited by people who had no interest in reliability. The 714 stamp had become a lie that anyone could tell. Lemon had created a brand so valuable that criminals would spend millions trying to copy it. That's marketing success. That's also the beginning of the end, because the counterfeiting problem wasn't going to solve itself. The recreational demand wasn't going to disappear. The gap between legal supply and illegal demand was only going to widen. Something had to give, and while the counterfeit market was polluting the street supply with dangerous fakes, another economy was emerging. An economy that didn't bother with pill presses and fake stamps. An economy that manufactured the real thing, just not in Pennsylvania. Not with FDA approval. Not with any legal authority at all. The underground empire was coming, and it would make the stress clinics look like lemonade stands. There's a moment in every drug epidemic where the legal supply can't meet the illegal demand. When that happens, entrepreneurs step in. And by entrepreneurs I mean chemists with flexible ethics, pilots with no questions, and businessmen who had decided that the DEA was just another regulatory challenge. By the late 1970s, the stress clinic model was under pressure. The DEA was slowly, belatedly paying attention. State medical boards were starting to revoke licenses. The newspapers were running exposés. The easy prescription pipeline was getting harder to access. But demand wasn't decreasing. If anything, demand was increasing. The cultural moment was still building. The parties were still happening. The appetite for Quaaludes was larger than ever. Supply constrained, demand expanding. That gap is where empires get built. Here's something that will surprise you. Making methaqualone is easier than making bread. The chemistry is simpler, the equipment is cheaper, and unlike bread, the profit margin is about 10,000%. I'm not going to give you a recipe, but I can tell you that methaqualone synthesis doesn't require a PhD. It doesn't require sophisticated laboratory equipment. It doesn't require rare precursor chemicals that are difficult to obtain. The synthesis involves a few steps, a few readily available chemicals, some basic glassware, and enough knowledge to follow a procedure. College chemistry students have the skills. The instructions were available in chemistry textbooks, in pharmaceutical patents, in the scientific literature that anyone could access at a decent library. Making methaqualone required roughly the same equipment as making meth would decades later. A chemistry degree helped, but enthusiasm and poor judgment could substitute. The precursor chemicals, the raw materials needed to synthesize methaqualone, were industrial chemicals with legitimate uses. They weren't regulated, they weren't tracked. You could order them from chemical supply companies the same way you'd order any other industrial material. Nobody was watching. Nobody was asking questions. The infrastructure for clandestine manufacturing existed, waiting for someone to use it. Someone used it. Forget the image of sophisticated drug labs you've seen in movies, Breaking Bad aesthetics. Sterile environments, precision equipment, men in hazmat suits monitoring computer displays. Early Quaalude manufacturing looked more like a college chemistry project gone commercial. Kitchen equipment, improvised glassware, and a recipe that wasn't much more complicated than making soap. Some operations were literally run out of kitchens. Garages, rented warehouse spaces with minimal ventilation and maximum ambition. The entrepreneurs who built these operations weren't criminal masterminds. They were opportunists who saw a market and had just enough chemistry knowledge to serve it. The quality varied accordingly. Some of these manufacturers made pills that were indistinguishable from lemons. They invested in proper equipment, proper technique, proper quality control. Their product was pharmaceutical grade, just without the pharmaceutical license. Some made pills that were indistinguishable from poison. The user had no way to know which they were getting. A pill from a careful manufacturer might deliver exactly the expected experience. A pill from a sloppy manufacturer might contain impurities, contaminants, dosing inconsistencies that turned a recreational evening into a medical emergency. This was the dark lottery of the underground market. Same price, same appearance, wildly different contents. Russian roulette with a pill press. The geographic footprint of illegal manufacturing spread quickly. South Florida became a hub, which made sense given its existing infrastructure for other illegal enterprises. Southern California developed its own manufacturing ecosystem. The Northeast had operations. The Midwest had operations. Anywhere there was demand and someone with basic chemistry skills, production could start. The economics were staggering. Precursor chemicals might cost a few $100s. Processing equipment might cost a few thousand. A successful batch could produce tens of thousands of pills. Each pill could sell for $3 to $5 on the street. Do the math. A few $1,000s in startup costs could generate hundreds of thousands in revenue. Per batch. Repeat as often as you could source materials and avoid arrest. These margins attracted attention, not just from small-time operators cooking pills in their garages, but from organizations with experience moving product at scale. This is where the story goes, international. By the late 1970s, methaqualone was also popular in South Africa under the brand name Mandrax. The manufacturing there was legal, regulated, industrial scale. South African pharmaceutical production was feeding both the domestic market and an export market that wasn't entirely legitimate. Diversion from South African production created a supply line to Europe and eventually to America. Pills manufactured legally on one continent showed up illegally on another. But the bigger international connection was closer to home, Colombia. The same infrastructure that was moving cocaine from South America to North America was perfectly suited for moving other drugs as well. The same pilots, the same planes, the same landing strips carved out of jungle or hidden in remote areas. The same networks of bribes and corruption that allowed cocaine to flow could allow anything else to flow just as easily. The same pilots flying cocaine from Colombia started adding another cargo. The same routes, the same planes, the same bribes, just different powder in the hold. By the early 1980s, methaqualone precursor chemicals were being shipped to clandestine labs in Colombia. Colombian operators would synthesize the drug, press it into pills, and send it north along the established cocaine routes. The efficiency was elegant, in a dark way. Why fly a plane half empty when you could fill it with multiple products? Why build separate distribution networks when one network could handle everything? The logistics of drug trafficking scaled just like any other logistics. This is where Quaalude stopped being an American problem and became an international industry. The supply chain that was built for this drug would later carry other drugs. Infrastructure doesn't care what moves through it. A smuggling route optimized for Quaaludes could move cocaine or marijuana or anything else the market demanded. The DEA found itself facing a challenge that didn't fit neatly into its existing frameworks. Domestic operations were hard enough to police. International operations required coordination with foreign governments. some of which were compromised by the drug trade itself. The money flowing through the illegal drug economy was corrupting institutions everywhere it touched. Colombia, Mexico, the Caribbean transit points. Every link in the supply chain had people who could be bought, officials who would look the other way, infrastructure that served the traffickers as readily as it served legitimate commerce. The same planes bringing cocaine from Colombia started bringing Quaalude precursors. Efficiency in logistics doesn't care about legality. And then there was the violence. Up until now, this story has been about excess and stupidity, rich people partying, doctors overprescribing, pharmaceutical companies looking away, cultural normalization, regulatory failure, unpleasant but not bloody. Now it becomes about bodies. When you operate outside the legal system, you have no access to the legal system's dispute resolution mechanisms. You can't sue a business partner who cheats you. You can't file a complaint when someone steals your inventory. You can't call the police when a competitor encroaches on your territory. You resolve disputes the old-fashioned way. The methaqualone trade attracted organized crime elements who were already experienced in violent enterprise. These weren't hippie chemists cooking pills for the enlightenment of humanity. These were businessmen who understood that market share sometimes required enforcement. Turf wars emerged. Not everywhere, not constantly, but with increasing frequency as the money got bigger and the competition got fiercer. A manufacturing operation might be raided not by police but by rivals. A distribution network might face threats not from the DEA but from competitors who wanted the territory. The recreational drug market was about to get a death toll. People died, not just from overdoses, though those continued. People died from bullets, from beatings, from the various methods that illegal enterprises use to maintain discipline and eliminate competition. The drug that was supposed to help people relax was now connected to organizations that resolved business disputes with automatic weapons. This transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. For years, Quaaludes had existed in a kind of grey zone, illegal but not dangerous in the violence sense. A party drug, not a cartel drug. Something you bought from a friend of a friend, not from people who might kill you. That changed. The underground economy matured into something uglier. The casual dealers who used to supply parties found themselves competing with professionals who didn't appreciate competition. The manufacturing operations that used to be amateur chemistry projects became targets for people who wanted to control supply. Violence breeds more violence. Once one organization demonstrates willingness to use force, other organizations must respond in kind or be eliminated. The escalation dynamic that characterizes every illegal market kicked in. By the early 1980s, the methaqualone trade had all the characteristics of serious organized crime. International supply chains, manufacturing operations of industrial scale, distribution networks spanning continents, and violence as a routine business practice. The same drug that was putting people to sleep in Hollywood bedrooms was now keeping DEA agents awake in Colombia, and the party wasn't slowing down. The domestic appetite for Quaaludes remained enormous. The international supply networks were meeting that appetite, sometimes with pharmaceutical quality product, sometimes with dangerous garbage, always with the understanding that this was now a serious criminal enterprise with serious criminal consequences. The contradiction was stark. On one end of the supply chain, murder, trafficking, international criminal organizations. On the other end, Studio 54, celebrity parties, casual recreational use by people who had no idea what they were funding. The same pill, different realities depending on where you stood. The users didn't see the supply chain. They saw a white pill with a familiar stamp. They saw a good time waiting to happen. They saw the next few hours of enhanced sensation and lowered inhibition. They didn't see the clandestine labs in Colombia. They didn't see the bodies that accumulated when distribution networks clashed. They didn't see the corruption spreading through institutions wherever drug money touched them. The pleasure and the violence existed simultaneously, connected by a supply chain that most users never thought about. This is always how it works with illegal drugs. The consumption end looks recreational. The supply end looks like war. The distance between them creates a convenient blindness. You don't have to think about where your good time comes from if you never look upstream. By 1982, the The methaqualone market was bigger than it had ever been. More users, more supply, more money flowing through systems designed to be invisible, and more dangerous than it had ever been. More violence, more counterfeits, more deaths from bad product and from the business practices that surrounded the product. The party was accelerating toward a peak nobody saw coming. Actually, that's not quite right. Some people saw it coming. The DEA saw it coming. They'd been watching the market grow, watching the international networks form, watching their jurisdiction expand from domestic prescription mills to global trafficking operations. They were planning a response, and unlike their previous half measures, this response was going to be different. This response was going to do something that had never been done to any drug before. This response was going to make Quaaludes disappear. Not reduce them, not control them, not manage them, erase them. But before the hammer fell, the drug would have one last moment in the sun. One peak year when consumption hit its maximum and the cultural presence was impossible to ignore. One last party before someone turned off the lights for good. The year was 1981, and it was going to be a hell of a year. 1981 was the year everyone in America knew what a Quaalude was. It was in the songs, it was in the movies, it was in the comedy routines, it was in the emergency rooms. Some people were having the time of their lives. Some people were ending their lives. Often they were the same people, just at different points in the evening. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers tell the story better than anything else. By 1981, Americans were consuming an estimated 20 million methaqualone pills every month. 20 million. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's the best estimate from people whose job it was to track these things. 20 million pills a month. That's not a drug problem. That's a drug economy. That's an industry. That's America consuming Quaaludes like they were candy, which at this point was basically what they were. To put that in perspective, 20 million pills a month means roughly 240 million pills a year. The US population in 1981 was about 230 million people. The math suggests that, on average, there was more than one Quaalude consumed per American per year, including children, including the elderly, including everyone who never touched the drug. Obviously, the consumption wasn't evenly distributed. Some people took none, some people took dozens per month, but the sheer scale of it should stop you for a moment. This wasn't a fringe phenomenon. This wasn't a subculture. This was American culture, period. The geographic spread by 1981 was complete. This was no longer a coastal drug, no longer a New York and LA phenomenon. Quaaludes had penetrated every region, every state, every city of meaningful size, small towns in the Midwest, suburbs in the South, college campuses everywhere. The distribution networks, both legal and illegal, had achieved total market saturation. The demographic spread was just as complete. The original user base of middle-aged insomnia patients had been joined by college students, young professionals, blue-collar workers, teenagers. There were Quaalude users in every tax bracket, every profession, every social class. The drug had achieved a kind of democratic ubiquity. The cultural footprint matched the consumption. Frank Zappa released a song called Quaalude in 1981. The Ramones had already referenced them, so had countless other artists. The drug showed up in lyrics across genres, from rock to disco to punk. Film reflected the reality. Movies set in contemporary America couldn't ignore what was happening at contemporary American parties. The drug appeared in scripts, in dialogue, in scenes that captured the era's pharmaceutical permissiveness. Television went even further. Comedy shows built sketches around Quaalude humor. Late-night hosts made jokes that assumed the audience knew exactly what they were talking about. Saturday Night Live didn't need to explain what ludes were. Everyone already knew. Name another Schedule II controlled substance that's been a punchline on network television. Go ahead, I'll wait. That's how normalized this had become. A drug that was legally equivalent to morphine in terms of regulatory classification. A drug that required a prescription and was supposed to be carefully monitored had become material for Johnny Carson monologues. The cultural permission was total. If you could joke about something on network TV, it couldn't be that bad, right? If celebrities were open about their use, if musicians wrote songs about it, If the whole apparatus of American entertainment treated it as a lifestyle choice rather than a dangerous drug, then maybe the warnings were overblown. That was the logic. That was the vibe. That was 1981. Here's where the party starts to look different depending on where you were standing. If you were at Studio 54, this was the best era in history. The drugs were flowing, the music was pumping, the nights were infinite, and the consequences were someone else's problem. The peak of Quaalude culture coincided with the peak of disco culture, and the combination felt like a permanent party that would never end. If you were in an emergency room, this was a disaster with no end in sight. Overdose statistics began climbing in the late 1970s and accelerated into the early 1980s. The safe alternative to barbiturates was sending people to hospitals at alarming rates. Methaqualone overdose looks like this. The user becomes increasingly sedated, then unconscious, then comatose. Breathing slows, blood pressure drops. If the dose is high enough, if it's combined with alcohol or other sedatives, breathing stops entirely. The therapeutic window, the gap between an effective dose and a dangerous dose, was wider than barbiturates. That was true, but wider doesn't mean infinite. You could still overdose. You could still die, especially if you were taking multiple pills to compensate for tolerance, especially if you were mixing with alcohol, especially if you had no idea what you were actually taking because you bought it on the street. The emergency room data told one story. The mortality data told another. By the early 1980s, methaqualone was appearing regularly on death certificates, not in barbiturate numbers, not yet, but in numbers that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. The non-addictive drug was producing addicts by the thousands. The safe alternative to barbiturates was filling morgues. The party drug was ending people. The mythology finally met the pharmacology, and then there was the tolerance problem. Here's what happens when you take a non-addictive drug for 2 years. You discover that word doesn't mean what you thought it meant, and by then stopping isn't simple anymore. Methaqualone tolerance develops like any other drug tolerance. The first time you take it, 1 pill might be plenty. After a few months of regular use, you need 2 pills for the same effect. After a year, maybe 3 or 4. The brain adapts to the presence of the chemical, recalibrates its response, demands more to achieve what less used to achieve. Long-term users found themselves in a trap. They needed the drug to feel normal. Without it, they experienced anxiety, insomnia, tremors, the whole constellation of withdrawal symptoms that addiction produces. The drug that was supposed to eliminate anxiety was now causing anxiety whenever it wore off, and the escalating doses meant escalating risk. Taking 1 Quaalude and having a drink was dangerous. Taking 4 Quaaludes and having several drinks was potentially lethal. But 4 Quaaludes was what some users needed after years of building tolerance. The combination with alcohol was particularly deadly. Both substances are central nervous system depressants, both slow breathing. Together they amplify each other's effects. A dose that might be survivable alone becomes fatal in combination. This synergy killed people who thought they knew what they were doing, experienced users who had taken the same amount many times before, except this time they had a few extra drinks. This time the pills were a little stronger than expected. This time their tolerance wasn't quite what they thought it was. The math of addiction is cruel. You keep needing more to feel the same, but the lethal dose doesn't increase at the same rate. Eventually, the amount you need and the amount that kills you start to overlap. By 1981, the overlap was claiming victims regularly. 1981 was the year America consumed more Quaaludes than aspirin in certain demographics. It was also the year America started to notice the bodies. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The parties were bigger than ever. The cultural presence was ubiquitous. The consumption numbers were astronomical, and the damage was mounting. Emergency room visits, overdose deaths, car accidents caused by impaired drivers, workplace accidents, falls, drownings, all the ways that profound sedation and impaired judgment can kill you. The human cost was accumulating alongside the human celebration, the same drug producing both simultaneously. At the peak, nobody imagines the fall. That's what makes it the peak. In 1981, the party felt permanent. The supply felt infinite. The consequences felt manageable, or at least acceptable. The good times outweighed the bad times, at least for the people having the good times. The people having the bad times weren't at the parties to complain. Nobody in the VIP room at Studio 54 was thinking about emergency room statistics. Nobody on a dance floor at 2 a.m. was contemplating mortality data. The peak feels like a plateau when you're standing on it. It feels like this is just how things are now, forever. But peaks don't last. That's the nature of peaks. They're followed by something else, and something else was coming. Something that had never happened to any drug before. Something that would transform the Quaalude market from a crisis into a memory. Something that would make this omnipresent substance essentially disappear within a few years. The DEA was watching, the regulators were planning, the pharmaceutical companies were starting to reconsider their positions. The international pressure was building. The political will was coalescing. All the elements were aligning for an intervention that would be unprecedented in the history of drug control. By 1984, this drug would be essentially impossible to find. Not expensive, not rare, not underground. Gone, vanished, erased from the American landscape, as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The people dancing in 1981 had no idea what was coming. The people taking pills had no idea those pills were about to become artifacts. The suppliers had no idea their business model was about to be destroyed. Something was about to happen that had never happened to any drug before, and nobody saw it coming. This was the peak. This was the last big party. This was the moment before everything changed. Enjoy it while it lasts. It won't last long. What I'm about to describe has never happened to any other drug. Not before, not since. In the span of about 3 years, Quaaludes went from being everywhere to being nowhere. Not reduced, not controlled, not driven underground, eliminated, erased. If you want to understand why this drug disappeared and others didn't, you need to understand exactly what happened between 1984 and 1987, and it starts with a number changing from 2 to 1. In the American drug scheduling system, substances are classified from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5 based on 2 criteria. Schedule 5 is the mildest. Cough syrups with small amounts of codeine, things you can sometimes get without a prescription. Schedule I is the most severe. Heroin, LSD, marijuana, controversially, drugs that the government has determined have no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. Schedule I substances can't be prescribed by doctors, can't be manufactured by pharmaceutical companies, can't legally exist in anyone's possession except under very specific research exemptions. For most of its American life, methaqualone was Schedule II, the same category as morphine, cocaine, and amphetamines. Dangerous, sure, controlled, absolutely, but medically legitimate. Doctors could prescribe it. Companies could make it. The system could manage it. In 1984, the DEA moved methaqualone to Schedule I. Moving a drug from Schedule II to Schedule I is supposed to be nearly impossible. It requires proving that the drug has no accepted medical use. For a drug that doctors had been prescribing for insomnia for 20 years, that's a hell of an argument to make. They made it anyway. The argument went like this. Whatever medical benefits methaqualone might offer could be achieved with other drugs that didn't come with the same abuse potential. Benzodiazepines like Valium could treat insomnia and anxiety. Other sedatives existed. Methaqualone wasn't unique in its therapeutic effects, only in its recreational appeal. Therefore, the medical use wasn't accepted in the sense that it was necessary. It was merely convenient, and convenience didn't justify the social cost. The rescheduling was controversial. Some doctors objected. Some researchers objected. But the political momentum was overwhelming. The years of headlines, the cultural saturation, the overdose statistics, the international trafficking, all of it had built pressure that demanded a response. Schedule. I was that response. Here's what Schedule I means in practice. It's not just illegal to sell. It's not just illegal to possess. It's illegal to make. It's illegal to possess. For research without extraordinary permits. It's illegal to exist outside of a handful of highly controlled circumstances. The government was declaring war on a molecule, not on the people who used it, not on the dealers who sold it, on the substance itself. The goal wasn't management, the goal was annihilation. And then the pharmaceutical companies did something unexpected. Lemon didn't fight, they didn't lobby Congress to reverse the decision, they didn't sue the DEA over the rescheduling, they didn't launch a public relations campaign arguing for the medical legitimacy of their product, they just stopped. In 1984, Lemon ceased production of methaqualone entirely. The last legal Quaalude rolled off the production line in Sellersville, Pennsylvania, and that was it. No fanfare, no announcement, just silence where there had been manufacturing. Think about how rare this is. A pharmaceutical company voluntarily stopping production of a profitable drug. No lawsuits, no settlements, no consent decrees. They just quit, walked away from a product that had made them famous or infamous, depending on your perspective. That tells you something about what they saw coming. That tells you the calculation had changed. The brand that had made them notorious was about to become a legal liability. Better to step away quietly than to be pushed away publicly. Other manufacturers followed within months. The handful of companies still producing methaqualone products announced discontinuation. The pharmaceutical industry was abandoning the molecule entirely, leaving it to the illegal manufacturers who were about to face their own reckoning. Lemon didn't fight, they didn't lobby, they just stopped. After years of defending their product, after years of arguing that they were simply making medicine for legitimate medical needs, they walked away. The calculation had changed. The brand that had made them famous was about to make them infamous, but the domestic shutdown was only part of the strategy. You can ban a drug in America and still have it flood in from elsewhere. The cocaine market proves that daily. The heroin market proves it hourly. Border control is imperfect. International trafficking routes are resilient. A ban without international coordination is just an invitation for smugglers. The DEA knew this, so they did something different. The international campaign that followed was unprecedented in its scope and its target. Diplomatic pressure was applied to every country with significant methaqualone production. The United States leaned on allies and trading partners to restrict manufacturing, to tighten export controls, to cooperate in enforcement actions, but the real innovation wasn't diplomatic pressure on finished drugs, it was something simpler and more elegant: precursor control. The precursor chemicals for methaqualone aren't naturally occurring. You can't grow them, you can't extract them from plants, you can't harvest them from any living thing. You have to manufacture them. And the number of companies in the world capable of manufacturing these specific chemicals was surprisingly small. The DEA couldn't stop cocaine because coca plants grow in the Andes and farmers will always plant them. The DEA couldn't stop heroin because opium poppies grow across Asia and eradication is impossible. The DEA couldn't stop marijuana because the plant grows almost anywhere and millions of people cultivate it. But methaqualone? Methaqualone required specific industrial chemicals produced by specific industrial companies. The DEA went to those companies. They didn't threaten. They didn't litigate. They explained. They showed the data on what their products were being used for. They demonstrated the trail from chemical precursor to clandestine lab, to street corner to emergency room. And they asked, politely but firmly, for cooperation. The chemical companies cooperated, not because they were legally required to in most cases, because the PR nightmare of being associated with the drug trade wasn't worth the revenue from selling precursor chemicals. Because the legitimate uses of these chemicals were limited enough that suspicious orders were obvious, because it was the right thing to do, or at least the smart thing to do. One by one, the chemical supply companies implemented controls. Suspicious orders got flagged. Exports to certain destinations got blocked. The raw materials needed to manufacture methaqualone became harder and harder to obtain. The DEA couldn't stop cocaine, couldn't stop heroin, couldn't stop marijuana. But Quaaludes? They figured out the trick. Control the chemicals you need to make it, and the drug disappears. This only works for synthetic drugs. It only works when the precursor chemicals are unusual enough to track and limited enough to control. It only works when the number of suppliers is small enough to coordinate. But for drugs that meet those criteria, it works. The precursor chemicals for methaqualone aren't naturally occurring. You can't grow them, you can't extract them from plants. You have to manufacture them. And the DEA got every major chemical company in the world to agree to stop selling them to anyone suspicious. That was the kill shot. The underground manufacturers who had been producing millions of pills suddenly couldn't source the materials they needed. The Colombian operations, the domestic labs, the international suppliers, all of them depended on the same precursor chemical supply chain. When that supply chain closed, production didn't decline, production collapsed. By 1985, finding real Quaaludes in America was becoming difficult. The pills that were available were increasingly counterfeits of uncertain quality. The real thing was drying up. By 1986, the shortage was severe. Users who had taken the drug's availability for granted found themselves unable to find it. The party that had seemed permanent was ending. By 1988, Quaaludes were essentially non-existent in the American market. In 1983, you could find Quaaludes in any city in America. By 1988, you couldn't find one if you tried. No other drug in history has disappeared this completely. The counterfeits dried up too. Eventually, counterfeiters had relied on the existence of a real product to anchor expectations. When nobody could remember what a real Quaalude felt like, when there was no benchmark to compare against, the counterfeit market lost its foundation. Why sell fake 714S when nobody knows what real 714S are supposed to be? Why maintain a brand that has no original? The whole market ecology collapsed. Not just the legal production, not just the illegal production, but the counterfeit production too. The drug simply ceased to exist in any meaningful quantity. This is the part that still surprises people. We're used to drug markets being resilient. We're used to prohibition being an endless game of whack-a-mole. We're used to supply finding a way, to dealers adapting, to the market surviving any assault. Quaaludes didn't survive. By 1988, you couldn't find a Quaalude in America if you tried. Not expensive, not rare, gone. The extinction event had worked. There was one exception, one last holdout on the planet where methaqualone persisted: South Africa. Under the brand name Mandrax, methaqualone remained legal and available in South Africa years after it had disappeared everywhere else. The drug became deeply embedded in South African drug culture, particularly in certain communities where it was smoked mixed with marijuana in a practice called white pipe. The South African exception persisted into the 2000s. The last legal production for any market anywhere in the world, a strange footnote to a drug that had once been everywhere. Eventually, even South Africa moved to restrict and ultimately eliminate methaqualone production. The global coordination that had choked the drug in the 1980s finally reached the last holdout. By the 2000s, Quaaludes had joined a very short list. Drugs that were once common, once culturally significant, once consumed by millions, and are now essentially impossible to find anywhere on Earth. The extinction was complete. The government had spent decades trying to eliminate various drugs. War on drugs. Just say no. Billions of dollars, millions of arrests. All the apparatus of prohibition aimed at marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and countless other substances. None of it worked. Not really. The drugs persisted. The markets adapted. The supply found its way to the demand. With Quaaludes, they finally figured out how. Eliminate the drug itself, not just the users. Control the supply chain at its source. Make the molecule impossible to manufacture rather than merely illegal to possess. Precursor control is the only drug elimination strategy that has ever worked completely. It only works for synthetic drugs. It only works when the chemistry requires unusual ingredients. It only works when international cooperation is achievable, but when those conditions are met, it works. The question is why we've never used it as effectively again. The opioid crisis involves synthetic drugs. Fentanyl requires precursor chemicals. The same strategy that eliminated Quaaludes could theoretically be applied to fentanyl. It hasn't been. The methamphetamine crisis involves synthetic drugs. Precursor chemicals are controllable, at least in theory. We've made some efforts, with some success, but nothing like the Quaalude elimination. Nothing as complete, nothing as final. Was Quaalude elimination a victory? The overdoses stopped. The emergency room visits stopped. The deaths from this particular drug stopped. In that narrow sense, yes, lives were saved, a dangerous substance was removed from circulation, but the demand didn't disappear. The appetite for sedation, for euphoria, for chemical escape that remained. It found other outlets, other drugs, other pills. The people who wanted what Quaaludes offered didn't stop wanting it. They just had to find it somewhere else, and they did. The extinction was complete. But was it a victory? And if it was a victory, why haven't we repeated it? Most people under 40 have never seen a Quaalude. They know about them from one place, a movie. Specifically, Wolf of Wall Street, 2013. Martin Scorsese directing. Leonardo DiCaprio starring. A 3-hour epic about Jordan Belfort, a stockbroker who defrauded investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars while consuming industrial quantities of drugs. The Quaalude scene became iconic. Belfort takes expired lemon 714s that have gained potency with age. The high hits him at a country club. He becomes so incapacitated that he has to crawl to his car, unable to walk, unable to speak coherently, a physical comedy performance that earned DiCaprio award nominations. The scene is hilarious. It's meant to be hilarious. Scorsese is a master, and DiCaprio is giving everything he has. The audience laughs because the movie wants them to laugh. That's how history becomes mythology. The pill disappears. The story remains. The lesson gets lost somewhere in between. Martin Scorsese made Quaaludes look like the funniest drug in history. Jordan Belfort crawling to his car is cinema comedy. The people who actually overdosed on Quaaludes weren't crawling anywhere. They were lying still, not breathing, while someone called 911 or didn't. The movie is about a criminal, a man who stole from ordinary people to fund his lifestyle of excess. He went to prison, though not for very long. He emerged to write books and give motivational speeches and profit from his own criminality. And somehow, he's the hero of the movie, or at least the protagonist we're meant to find fascinating, charismatic, entertaining. That's what Quaaludes have become in cultural memory. Entertainment. A punchline from a better time. A vintage high that sounds fun and dangerous in that appealing way that dangerous things sound when you're watching them safely from a theatre seat. The mythology eats the history. What people think Quaaludes were, a party drug from the disco era, glamorous, fun, something celebrities did at Studio 54 before doing other glamorous things. What Quaaludes actually were, a drug that killed people, that addicted people, that was used to facilitate sexual assaults, that funded international criminal organizations, that filled emergency rooms and morgues, that destroyed families and ended lives. Both things are true. The parties happened. The deaths happened. They happened simultaneously to different people, sometimes to the same people at different moments. But we only remember the parties. We only tell stories about the parties. The deaths aren't cinematic. The addiction isn't funny. The woman who was drugged and assaulted doesn't get a comedy scene. The romanticization of extinct drugs is a particular kind of cultural amnesia. We remember what we want to remember. We turn tragedy into nostalgia given enough time. Now here's where we need to sit with some uncomfortable questions. We figured out how to eliminate a drug completely. The precursor control strategy worked. The international coordination worked. The regulatory assault worked. Then we didn't use that knowledge again. The opioid crisis happened with synthetic drugs. Fentanyl is manufactured. OxyContin was manufactured. The same strategic approach that eliminated methaqualone could theoretically have been applied. It wasn't. Why? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Quaaludes were eliminated when they stopped being profitable for the right people. By 1984, the pharmaceutical companies had calculated that methaqualone was more trouble than it was worth. The regulatory pressure was mounting. The public relations nightmare was worsening. The liability exposure was growing. Lemon didn't fight the Schedule 1 reclassification because fighting would have cost more than surrendering. The molecule had become a burden rather than an asset. Letting it die was the smart business decision. OxyContin was never going to be eliminated because it was profitable for the right people for too long. Purdue Pharma made billions. The Sackler family became one of the wealthiest families in America. The prescriptions kept flowing because the revenue kept flowing, because the lobbying kept working, because the regulatory capture kept holding. By the time the bodies had piled high enough to force action, the damage was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions addicted, communities devastated across the country. The opioid crisis wasn't a surprise. The patterns were visible. The warning signs were documented. The trajectory was predictable. If you've been paying attention to this video, the opioid crisis pattern should look familiar. Non-addictive prescription drug. That's what they said about OxyContin. Purdue Pharma marketed it as having a lower addiction potential than other opioids. The phrase non-addictive doing the same heavy lifting it had done for methaqualone decades earlier. Overprescribing epidemic. Doctors writing prescriptions for conditions that didn't require opioids. Pain clinics that functioned exactly like stress clinics, pushing pills to anyone who walked in the door. Medical system as distribution network. The pharmaceutical pipeline serving as the delivery mechanism for recreational and dependent use. Legal production feeding illegal consumption. Addiction denial. The same cognitive dissonance. The same reluctance to acknowledge what was obvious. The same preference for comfortable words over uncomfortable truths. Bodies piling up. Emergency rooms. Overdoses. Funerals. We did this before. We're doing it again. The molecule changed. The story didn't. We eliminated Quaaludes and declared victory. Then we handed out OxyContin for back pain and declared it non-addictive. The pharmaceutical industry has a very short memory, or a very long confidence game. The patterns repeat because the incentives repeat. There's money in selling pills. There's money in creating demand. There's money in every step of the chain except the last one, where someone's child stops breathing. The costs are externalized. The families bear them. The communities bear them. The healthcare system bears them. The profits stay with the companies. This is not a conspiracy. This is economics. This is what happens when the people making decisions don't bear the consequences of those decisions. When the feedback loop between action and outcome is broken by money and lawyers and corporate structure. Now let's talk about the people. Because we've been talking about systems and policies and markets, and it's easy to forget that every number in this story was a person. Every pill consumed was consumed by someone. Someone with a name and a face and people who loved them. Someone who was looking for something, sleep, relief, escape, pleasure, and found a white pill that promised to provide it. Every overdose had a name, had a family, had a life that ended or changed forever. Every addiction was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend, someone who started taking a pill for a reason that seemed good at the time and ended up unable to stop. The statistics are convenient. They let us talk about millions of pills without thinking about millions of people. They let us discuss trends and patterns without sitting with individual grief. The people were not convenient. They were complicated. They made choices that seemed reasonable until they weren't. They trusted doctors who trusted pharmaceutical companies who trusted their own marketing. They were failed by systems that were supposed to protect them. Some of them died. Some of them recovered. Some of them are still struggling with addictions that started decades ago, with a drug that no longer exists, that they can still remember wanting. The mythology says the Quaalude era was glamorous. The reality is that it was deadly. Both things are true, and holding both in mind is difficult, and we usually don't bother. So where does that leave us? What do we learn from a drug that was everywhere and then was nowhere? Here's what the Quaalude story teaches us. If we're willing to learn, we can eliminate drugs when we choose to. The precursor control strategy worked. International coordination worked. Regulatory determination worked. When the political will existed, when the corporate cooperation could be obtained, when the chemistry was controllable, the drug disappeared. This wasn't impossible. It wasn't even particularly complicated. It just required choosing to do it. The question is, who chooses? And how do they choose which drugs to eliminate and which to tolerate? The answer has never been about pharmacology. It's not about which drugs are most dangerous, most addictive, most socially destructive. If it were, alcohol would have been eliminated a century ago. It's about money. It's about politics. It's about who's using and who's profiting. It's about which constituencies have power and which don't. It's about whose deaths count and whose deaths are statistics. Quaaludes were eliminated when they stopped being profitable and started being embarrassing. When the cultural moment turned against them, when the political calculation favored action over inaction, other drugs persist because the opposite conditions apply, because someone powerful is still making money, because the political calculation favors inaction, because the deaths happen to people without enough political power to matter. Should eradication be the model for other drugs? That's not a simple question. Harm reduction advocates argue that elimination is impossible for most drugs, and that we should focus on minimizing damage rather than pursuing abstinence. They have evidence on their side. The war on drugs has largely failed to eliminate anything, but Quaaludes prove that elimination is possible under certain conditions. The question is whether those conditions can be replicated, and whether we want to replicate them. The demand for sedation, for euphoria, for escape, did it disappear when Quaaludes disappeared? Of course not. The appetite found other outlets: benzodiazepines, opioids, alcohol, whatever was available. We eliminated one drug and the underlying need remained. The need found new products, new markets, new ways to fill the hole that human beings seem determined to fill. Maybe that's the deepest lesson of the Quaalude story. You can eliminate a molecule. You can't eliminate the reason people wanted it. The desire to feel different, the desire to escape, the desire to sleep, to relax, to stop thinking for a while, the desire to feel pleasure, to feel connection, to feel anything other than the ordinary weight of ordinary life. That desire predates Quaaludes. It survived Quaaludes. It will outlast whatever comes next. The question isn't whether people will seek chemical alteration. They will. They always have. They always will. The question is how we respond. With prohibition? With harm reduction? With regulation? With some combination that we haven't figured out yet? I don't have the answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I know this much. The Quaalude story isn't over. Just because the drug is gone, the same pharmaceutical industry exists. The same incentive structures exist. The same regulatory weaknesses exist. The same cultural willingness to believe non-addictive exists. Somewhere right now, a pharmaceutical company is marketing a drug with claims that will look absurd in 30 years. Somewhere a doctor is overprescribing because it's easier than not overprescribing. Somewhere a person is taking a pill that they've been assured is safe because someone with a white coat and a prescription pad told them so. The molecule changes. The story doesn't. Maybe someday we'll learn. Maybe someday we'll remember the Quaalude story and the opioid story and whatever story comes next. And we'll recognize the pattern before the bodies pile up. Maybe, but probably not, because forgetting is easier than remembering, and the pharmaceutical industry is very, very good at making us forget. The pill is gone, the story remains, the lesson is up to you. So let's step back and look at what we've witnessed. A drug made to be safe that wasn't. A medicine that became a party that became an epidemic that became a ghost. This is the story of a small white pill that went from laboratory to prescription pad to medicine cabinet to nightclub to courtroom to nowhere. It lasted about 20 years from introduction to extinction. That's less time than some mortgages, less time than it takes to raise a child, less time than many careers. In that 20 years, Quaaludes went from pharmaceutical innovation to cultural phenomenon to international criminal enterprise to historical footnote. The speed of that arc should disturb us. The completeness of the erasure should fascinate us. A scientist in India was looking for a malaria cure in 1951. He accidentally created something else. That accidental creation traveled through pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies and doctors' offices and pharmacies. It traveled through Hollywood parties and disco clubs and college dorms. It traveled through stress clinics and underground labs and international smuggling routes. And then it vanished. The question we're left with is simple but uncomfortable. Did eradication work, or did it just move the appetite? We eliminated the drug, we didn't eliminate the need. The need found benzodiazepines. The need found opioids. The need found alcohol and marijuana and whatever else was available. The appetite for sedation, for euphoria, for escape, for a few hours of feeling different than ordinary life makes you feel that appetite remained. Only the menu changed. If you eliminate one item from the menu, people order something else. The hunger persists. The restaurant stays open. The transaction continues, just with different products. Maybe Quaalude elimination saved lives. Probably it did. The specific overdoses from that specific drug stopped happening. That's not nothing. But the underlying crisis, the reason millions of people wanted to swallow those pills in the first place, that didn't get addressed. That didn't get eliminated. That just found new expression. And so the story repeats. History doesn't repeat, people say. It rhymes. The Quaalude story is also the opioid story. The same pharmaceutical overconfidence. The same non-addictive marketing. The same overprescribing epidemic. The same medical system functioning as distribution network. The same bodies. The same grief. The same belated recognition that something had gone terribly wrong. The Quaalude story is also the next story. Whatever comes after opioids. Whatever pill or powder or product emerges next with promises of safety that turn out to be lies. Whatever need the pharmaceutical industry identifies and decides to fill with something that looks like medicine and works like something else. The patterns persist because we don't learn from patterns. We don't teach this history. We don't remember these lessons. Each generation discovers the same truths independently, at the same cost, with the same surprise. Maybe this time we'll remember. Maybe the next non-addictive prescription drug will get more scrutiny. Maybe the next pharmaceutical marketing campaign will face more skepticism. Maybe the next time a company says trust us, someone in authority will ask for proof. Maybe, but probably not, because forgetting is easier than remembering, and the pharmaceutical industry is very, very good at making us forget. They're good at it because it's profitable. They're good at it because the legal system protects them. They're good at it because we want to believe there's a pill that fixes things. We want to believe the doctor knows best. We want to believe that this time is different. It's not different, it's the same. The molecule changes, the story doesn't. Before we began, I told you this was a story about a pill that vanished, a drug that was everywhere and then was nowhere. Now you know how that happened. A pharmaceutical company made a promise, safe and non-addictive. Doctors believed the promise, patients believed the doctors, the pills flowed, the culture absorbed them, the abuse escalated, the deaths mounted, the regulations tightened, the supply chains closed, the molecule disappeared. Now you know why it happened. Money, incentives, regulatory failure, cultural permission, human appetite. The same forces that shape every drug epidemic, every pharmaceutical disaster, every story where corporations profit and people die. The pill is gone. The story remains. The lesson is up to you. What you do with this knowledge matters, whether you remember it the next time someone promises you a safe solution in pill form, whether you question the marketing, the claims, the confident assurances of industries that have been confidently wrong before. History isn't just what happened. History is what we do with what happened, and that part isn't finished. Thanks for taking this journey with me. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what struck you most. Was it the Hollywood glamour, the stress clinic economics, the extinction strategy, the echoes of the opioid crisis? I want to know what landed for you. I want to know what you'll carry forward. Now, turn off the screen, get some rest. And maybe when someone offers you a promise that sounds too good to be true, remember the small white pill that was supposed to be safe. Remember what happened. Remember what always happens. Until next time.